You'd think that at 20 years old, the biggest thing on my mind would be my upcoming wedding, the flowers, the dress, or the way my heart skips a beat every time I look at the man I'm about to spend the rest of my life with. And for a while it was. Ethan is 23, and he is everything I ever dreamed of: patient, kind, and the kind of person who makes you feel like the most important person in the room even when there's a crowd of 100 people. When he proposed, it felt like the start of a fairy tale. I spent weeks staring at the ring on my finger, watching the light catch the stone, imagining our future together. I could see it so clearly: the white aisle, the music, our families gathered together to celebrate a love that felt so solid and certain. But as the planning progressed and the guest list began to take shape, a shadow started to creep over that vision. It was a shadow I had grown up with, one that I had learned to navigate like a minefield, but now it was threatening to blow up the one day I wanted to be perfect. That shadow has a name: Kyler. He's my uncle, but at 29 years old, he feels like a stranger from a different lifetime. He's my mother's younger brother, and for the first decade of my life, he was just my cool older uncle who played games with me and had a laugh that could fill a room. But that Kyler, the one who was supposed to go to college, get a job, and maybe even have a wedding of his own, vanished during his senior year of high school. It wasn't a slow fade. It wasn't a gradual decline that gave us time to prepare or understand what was happening. It was what my family always refers to as the snap. One day, he was a teenager with a bright future, and the next, he was a prisoner of his own mind, fractured by a diagnosis of schizophrenia that hit him like a freight train. Since that snap, Kyler hasn't been able to function in the world most of us live in. He doesn't hold a job, he doesn't have friends, he doesn't even have his own home. He lives with my grandma and grandpa, who have effectively put their entire lives on hold for the last decade to keep him safe. They are his anchors, his nurses, and his guards. Their house is different from other people's houses. There are no mirrors in the common areas because Kyler can't stand the sight of himself. If he sees his own reflection, he doesn't see a young man. He sees something he hates, something he fears, and he will punch the glass until his knuckles are shredded and the mirror is in pieces on the floor. The windows are often locked, and the atmosphere is thick with the heavy, acrid smell of chain-smoked cigarettes, the only thing that seems to quiet the voices in his head, if only for a few minutes. I love my grandparents more than I can put into words. They are the backbone of our family, the people who showed me what unconditional love looks like. But their love for Kyler has created a complicated reality for everyone else. Because they are his primary caretakers, their lives revolve around his schedule, his moods, and his safety. My grandfather works during the day, and my grandmother works nights a relay race of caretaking that ensures Kyler is never ever alone. They can't leave him. They don't dare. Because if they do, the consequences are terrifying. I remember one time, just a few years ago, we tried to have a normal family outing. It was my grandmother's birthday, and we went to this local Mexican restaurant. It was one of those places that is always packed full of the sounds of clinking silverware, loud music, and the low hum of dozens of conversations. Kyler was there, sitting at the end of the table. He was quiet, which we usually took as a good sign. He was just staring at his plate of tacos, his eyes fixed on nothing. I remember thinking, maybe today will be okay. Maybe he's having a good day. But then, without warning, the silence broke. Kyler didn't just speak. He lunged upward his chair, scraping violently against the floor, and began to scream at the top of his lungs. He wasn't screaming about the food or the noise. He was screaming at me. "I know," he yelled, his face turning a deep, frantic red. "I know your secret identity. I see you. I know who you really are." The entire restaurant went silent. Every head turned. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a mixture of profound embarrassment and a deep, aching sadness. My grandmother tried to shush him, her hands trembling as she reached for his arm, but he was gone, lost in whatever hallucination had gripped him. He wasn't in a Mexican restaurant with his family anymore. He was in a battlefield. We had to leave immediately, the bill paid, and a rush our heads down as we ushered him out into the parking lot. That's the reality of Kyler. He can be calm for hours, and then in a heartbeat he can turn a normal moment into a nightmare. Now, as Ethan and I sit at our kitchen table with the wedding invitations spread out before us, the weight of Kyler's presence, or lack thereof, is all we can talk about. Ethan is wonderful, and he's tried so hard to be understanding. He's met Kyler a handful of times, always in controlled environments, always with my grandparents nearby. He's seen the vacant stares and the way Kyler talks to people who aren't there. He knows the risks. But this is our wedding. This is the day we've been saving for, the day we've dreamed about. If we don't invite him. "Maya," Ethan said softly, tracing the edge of an envelope, "will your grandparents even be able to come?" That's the heart of the problem. It's a mathematical impossibility in their world. If Kyler isn't invited, one of them has to stay behind to watch him. They can't hire a sitter. Kyler doesn't trust strangers, and he's prone to running away. He has a fixation with the woods near their house, believing he has to leave offerings there. They're bits of food, shiny objects, sometimes things he's stolen from around the house. More dangerously, he has a tendency to run toward oncoming traffic as if he's trying to test the reality of the world around him. You can't just leave a person like that with a neighbor or a teenager from down the street. It's my grandmother or my grandfather, one or the other. The thought of one of them missing my wedding breaks my heart. I want them both there. I want to see my grandfather's eyes well up when he sees me in my dress. I want to dance with him. I want my grandmother to be there to tuck a stray hair behind my ear before I walk down the aisle. They are the ones who raised me as much as my own parents did, but the cost of having them both there is inviting Kyler. And Kyler at a wedding? The thought alone sends a chill down my spine. A wedding is a sensory overload. There are lights, music, crowds of people, and most importantly, rituals. My biggest fear is that Kyler will see the ceremony not as a celebration of love, but as some kind of dark ritual. He's obsessed with the idea that people are out to get him, or that there are hidden meanings in everyday actions. What happens when I'm standing at the altar? Will he think it's a sacrifice? Will he think the priest is a threat? Will he stand up and scream about my secret identity in the middle of our vows? I stared at the guest list, my eyes blurring. I felt like I was being forced to choose between the safety and sanctity of my wedding day and the people I love most in the world. It felt like an impossible choice, a trap with no clean escape. I looked over at Ethan, hoping he had an answer, but I could see the same conflict mirrored in his eyes. We were 20 and 23, trying to plan a future while being tethered to a past and a present that felt like it was dragging us under. A few days after that conversation at the kitchen table, Ethan and I decided to drive over to my grandparents' house. We needed to see them to feel the reality of the situation, rather than just theorizing about it over guest lists and floral arrangements. The drive was quiet, the kind of silence that isn't awkward, but heavy with shared thoughts. As we pulled into the gravel driveway of the small, weathered ranch-style home where my mother grew up, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. It's a beautiful spot, nestled right against the edge of a thick, sprawling forest, but to me, those trees always looked like they were leaning in, eavesdropping on a family that had been broken for a long time. Stepping inside my grandparents' house is like stepping into a different time zone, or maybe a different dimension altogether. The first thing that hits you is the smell, a thick, stale cloud of cigarette smoke that seems to have seeped into the very drywall and upholstery. It's a smell I've associated with Kyler for as long as I can remember. It's his only comfort, his only anchor to the physical world when the voices start to pull him under. My grandmother met us at the door, her face a map of exhaustion and love. She's only in her 60s, but the last decade has aged her double that. She greeted us with a tired smile and a hug that felt a little too tight, as if she were holding on for dear life. "He's having a quiet afternoon," she whispered, as if the very sound of her voice might shatter the fragile peace. We followed her into the living room, and there he was. Kyler was sitting in his usual chair by the window, the one that looked out toward the woods. He was hunched over his fingers, stained yellow from the cigarettes he burned through one after another. He didn't look up when we walked in. He was staring at his hands, his lips moving in a silent, frantic rhythm. It's a sight that still breaks my heart, no matter how many times I see it. This was the man who used to lift me onto his shoulders so I could reach the high branches of the apple tree. Now he looked like a ghost haunting his own body. "Hey, Uncle Kyler," I said softly, keeping my distance. I had learned the hard way that getting too close too fast could startle him, and a startled Kyler was an unpredictable Kyler. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into a small plastic bowl on the side table. It was filled with what looked like trash bits of colorful plastic, a few smooth stones, and some scraps of bread. He clutched a handful of the items and stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Without a word to us, he walked toward the back door. The offerings, my grandmother sighed, watching him go. He thinks if he doesn't leave them at the edge of the trees, the watchers will come inside. I've tried to tell him there are no watchers, but, well, you know how it is, Maya. It's better to just let him do it. It keeps him from pacing the hallways at 3 a.m. Ethan watched him through the window, his expression a mix of pity and profound unease. We watched as Kyler walked to the very edge of the lawn, where the grass met the dark undergrowth of the forest. He knelt down, placed the stones and bread scraps in a neat little pile, and then stood there for a long time whispering to the air. It was chilling to watch. It wasn't just quirky behavior. It was a man desperately trying to negotiate with a reality that only he could see. When Kyler finally came back inside, he seemed to notice us for the first time. His eyes were wide, darting from me to Ethan and then to the corners of the room. "The ceremony?" he muttered, his voice raspy from the smoke. "The birds told me about the ceremony. It's a binding, isn't it? A blood binding?" My heart skipped a beat. I looked at my grandmother, who just shook her head slightly. "He's been talking about the wedding, Maya. He knows it's coming. He hears us talking about it." "It's just a wedding, Kyler," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a celebration with family, like yours will be one day." The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Kyler's face contorted, a flash of pure, unadulterated rage crossing his features. "No, no mirrors. You can't have mirrors at the binding. They'll see us. They'll trap our souls in the glass." He suddenly lunged toward the wall where a small decorative mirror used to hang years ago. Even though the mirror was long gone, replaced by a framed picture of a landscape, he began to strike the wall with his fist over and over. "Kyler, stop! Stop it right now!" My grandfather had appeared from the hallway, his voice booming, but laced with a weariness that was painful to hear. He grabbed Kyler's arms, pulling him away from the wall. Kyler didn't fight back. He just slumped, the rage vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by a hollow, vacant look. We sat down in the kitchen, the four of us, while Kyler went back to his chair and lit another cigarette. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. My grandmother poured us some coffee, her hands shaking as the spoon clinked against the ceramic mugs. We want to talk about the wedding. I started looking from my grandmother to my grandfather. We want you both there so badly. You know that, but we've been talking about the logistics with Kyler. My grandfather took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes fixed on the table. We know it's a lot, Maya. We know what happened at the restaurant. We know he's not easy to be around. It's not just that he's not easy, Ethan added gently, trying to bridge the gap. It's that we want this day to be safe for everyone, especially for Maya, and for Kyler too. A big wedding with music and crowds. It seems like it would be a lot for him to handle. My grandmother looked away, her eyes welling with tears. If he doesn't go, one of us has to stay. You know the schedule. Your grandfather has the day shift that weekend, and I'm on nights. If we both come, Kyler is alone, and we can't leave him alone, Maya. Not after last month. What happened last month? I asked, a pit forming in my stomach. They hadn't told me everything. My grandfather sighed, rubbing his face with his weathered hands. He managed to get the back door unlocked while I was in the shower. He didn't go to the woods this time. He went toward the highway. By the time I realized he was gone and got to the road, he was standing right in the middle of the white line, staring down a semi-truck. He thought he was stopping time. The driver had to swerve into the ditch to miss him. If it had been a second later... He trailed off, the horror of the memory hanging in the air. The reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about Kyler being weird or making a scene. This was about a man who was a danger to himself and others, whose mind was a chaotic storm that no medication or hospital stay had been able to calm. My grandparents weren't just being difficult or overprotective, they were quite literally guarding a life. So if I don't invite him, I said, my voice barely a whisper, one of you won't be there to see me get married. We'll make it work somehow, my grandmother said, though she didn't sound like she believed it. Maybe one of us can come for the ceremony and then we can swap, but the venue is an hour away. By the time we swap, the wedding will be over. I looked out the window at Kyler, who was once again staring at the woods. I felt a surge of anger, which I immediately felt guilty for. Why did our lives have to revolve around his illness? Why did my wedding day have to be a casualty of a snap that happened 10 years ago? I wanted to scream, to demand that for just one day the world could be normal. But looking at my grandparents, at the toll this was taking on them, I realized that they probably felt that way every single day of their lives. What if we had a separate room? Ethan suggested, his voice tentative. At the venue. Somewhere quiet where he could sit with one of you away from the crowd. He could be there, but not in the middle of it. My grandfather shook his head slowly. He'd know. He'd hear the music. He'd see the people. And if he gets it into his head that it's a ritual, he'll try to run. And at a venue like that near the city, there are too many roads, Maya. Too many cars. I can't take that risk. I felt the walls closing in. Every solution we came up with was met with a dangerous reality. I looked at the man I loved and then at the family that had raised me and felt like I was being pulled apart. How do you choose between your own happiness and the safety of your family? How do you tell your grandparents that the person they've dedicated their lives to is the one person you don't want at your wedding? The drive home from my grandparents' house was the quietest hour Ethan and I had ever shared. Usually our car rides were filled with music, planning our future, or laughing about something silly that had happened at work. But that day, the air in the car felt thick, as if we had brought a piece of that heavy, smoke-filled atmosphere back with us. I could still smell the stale tobacco on my clothes, a lingering reminder of the world Kyler lived in, a world where mirrors were enemies, and bread scraps were peace offerings to unseen watchers in the woods. Ethan gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles slightly white. I knew him well enough to know his mind was racing, trying to find a logical solution to an illogical problem. That was one of the things I loved about him, his engineer's brain always looking for a way to fix what was broken. But schizophrenia wasn't a bridge with a structural flaw, or a piece of code with a bug. It was a storm that didn't follow the laws of physics. Maya, he said finally, his voice breaking the silence like a stone dropped into a still pond. The story about the truck, that changed things for me. I mean, I knew he was sick, but I didn't realize that he was actively trying to stop time by standing in front of a semi. I stared out the side window, watching the trees blur past. My grandparents don't like to talk about the bad days. They want to believe that the real Kyler is still in there, just buried under the noise. But the bad days are becoming most days now. It's not just about the embarrassment of him screaming at the restaurant anymore. Ethan continued, his tone growing more serious. It's a massive liability. If he's at the wedding and he sees a car, or he thinks the watchers are coming and he runs... Maya, we're getting married at that estate near the interstate. It's beautiful, but it's right next to a major road. If he bolts, we might be spending our wedding night at a hospital. Or worse. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. He was right. The venue we had chosen was stunning, a historic mansion with sprawling gardens and a fountain. But it was also open with multiple exits and a long driveway that led directly to a busy 4-lane highway. For a man who believed he could stop time by standing in the path of a truck, it was a death trap. But what do I do, Ethan? I asked, my voice cracking. If I tell my grandparents he can't come, I'm effectively telling one of them they're not invited either. How do I choose which grandparent gets to see me get married? How do I tell my grandmother, who has sacrificed everything for that man, that her son isn't welcome at the biggest event of my life? I don't know, Ethan whispered. I really don't know. When we got back to our apartment, I couldn't sit still. I paced the small living room, my mind spinning. I felt a desperate need for a third opinion, someone who knew the family history but wasn't as deep in the trenches as my grandparents. I picked up my phone and called my mother. My mom has a complicated relationship with Kyler. He's her younger brother, the baby of the family, and she remembers him before the snap more vividly than I do. But she also moved 2 states away 5 years ago, partly for a job and partly, I suspect, because she couldn't handle the slow-motion tragedy happening in her parents' living room. She loves Kyler, but she also resents the way he swallowed her parents' retirement and their peace of mind. Mom, I said as soon as she picked up, we just left Grandma's. We talked about the wedding guest list. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her sighing. And how did they take it? They didn't take it anyway yet, I said. But Grandpa told us about the incident with the semi-truck last month. Mom, why didn't you tell me it was that bad? Because what would it have changed, Maya? Her voice sounded tired, a mirror of my grandmother's exhaustion. It's been 10 years of incidents. If we told you every time Kyler tried to run away or every time he broke a mirror, you wouldn't have a life of your own. You'd just be living in that house with them. He thinks the wedding is a blood binding. I told her, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. He thinks the birds are talking to him about it. He told me I shouldn't have mirrors because they'll trap our souls. He's escalating, she said, her voice sharpening. He does this when there's a big change or a big event coming up. The energy in the house changes, and he picks up on it. He doesn't understand weddings or celebrations. He just feels the tension, and his brain turns it into a conspiracy. So what do I do if I don't invite him? Grandma or Grandpa has to stay home. I want them there, Mom. I need them there. Maya, listen to me, my mother said, her tone becoming uncharacteristically firm. You cannot have Kyler at that wedding. I love my brother, or at least I love the memory of who he was. But Kyler, as he is now, is a grenade. You don't bring a grenade to a wedding and just hope the pin stays in. If he has an episode, and he will because of the crowds and the noise, it won't just ruin the day. It will traumatize everyone there. It will be the only thing anyone remembers about your wedding. But Grandma will be devastated, I argued, even though I knew she was right. My mother has been devastated for 10 years, she countered. She's chosen her path. She's chosen to be Kyler's keeper. That is her right, and it's a noble thing she's doing. But she doesn't get to choose that for you too. This is your day, yours and Ethan's. You are allowed to have one day where you aren't a supporting character in Kyler's illness. I hung up the phone feeling more conflicted than ever. My mother's words were harsh, but they were true. Yet the thought of my grandmother sitting at home watching Kyler smoke cigarette after cigarette while I walked down the aisle felt like a betrayal. I could picture her sitting in that dark living room, hearing the distant sound of the highway, knowing her only granddaughter was starting a new life while she was stuck in a cycle that would never end. The next few weeks were a blur of what-ifs. I started having nightmares about the wedding. In one, I was standing at the altar, and instead of Ethan, it was Kyler screaming that he knew my secret identity. In another, I was looking into a mirror in my bridal suite, and my reflection was Kyler's face shattering the glass with his bare hands. The stress was starting to bleed into my relationship with Ethan. We found ourselves snapping at each other over small things, the underlying tension of the Kyler problem, always present. One evening, I decided to go back to my grandparents' house alone. I wanted to talk to my grandmother woman to woman without the men around to see if there was any middle ground we hadn't explored. When I arrived, the house was unusually quiet. My grandfather was at work and Kyler was in his room. My grandmother was sitting at the kitchen table, a pile of mail in front of her that she wasn't actually reading. "Grandma," I said, sitting across from her, "can we talk, really talk?" She looked at me, and for a second the mask of everything is fine slipped. I saw the deep hollows under her eyes and the way her shoulders slumped. "It's about Kyler and the wedding, isn't it?" "I'm scared, Grandma," I admitted. "I'm scared he'll get hurt. I'm scared he'll hurt someone else. And I'm scared that if he's there, I won't be able to focus on Ethan. I'll just be watching Kyler waiting for the snap to happen." She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was like parchment, thin and dry. "I know, sweetheart. I know. Every time we go out, I feel the same way. It's like living with a ticking clock in your pocket, and you never know when the alarm is going to go off." "Then why?" I asked. "Why do you insist he has to be included in everything? Why can't we find a way for you to just be my grandma for one day?" She looked toward Kyler's closed bedroom door, her expression softening into something so full of grief, it made my chest ache. Because if I don't include him, Maya, he stops being a person. The world has already given up on him. The doctors, the state, the neighbors. They all look at him and see a case, or a nuisance. If his own mother treats him like a secret to be hidden away, what does he have left? But he's not just a person," I whispered. "He's a person who tried to stop a semi-truck with his mind. He's a person who thinks I'm part of a blood ritual. You're asking me to risk my safety and the safety of my guests to prove a point about his humanity." The silence that followed was heavy. My grandmother didn't get angry. She didn't yell. She just looked at me with a profound, quiet sadness. I'm not trying to prove a point, Maya. I'm just trying to keep my son's soul from flickering out completely. But I see now, I've been asking you to carry a weight that isn't yours to bear. I felt a glimmer of hope. Does that mean... It means, she said, her voice trembling, that your grandfather and I have a decision to make, and you have one too. That conversation with my grandmother felt like a temporary truce, but it didn't bring the peace I was hoping for. If anything, the air in my own apartment started to feel just as heavy as the air in theirs. Every time I looked at a wedding magazine or scrolled through Pinterest looking at centerpieces, I didn't see flowers and lace. I saw Kyler's stained fingers and the vacant, haunting look in his eyes. I started to realize that this wasn't just a guest list problem, it was a ghost that had been haunting my family for a decade, and I was finally being forced to look it in the eye. As the weeks ticked by and the wedding date drew closer, Kyler's condition seemed to take a sharp turn for the worse. My grandmother called me one Tuesday morning, her voice sounding small and brittle. She told me that Kyler had stopped eating anything that wasn't sealed by the light. He had developed a new delusion that the food in their pantry was being poisoned by the watchers in the woods, and the only things he deemed safe were individual bags of chips or canned sodas that he opened himself. He was losing weight, his cheeks hollowing out, making his eyes look even larger and more frantic. He found the invitation, Maya, she whispered into the phone. I had it tucked away in my dresser, but he's been searching. He's been going through our things when we're not looking. What did he do? I asked, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. He didn't tear it up, she said, and I could hear the confusion in her voice. He took it out to the woods. I found it yesterday morning pinned to a tree with a rusted nail. He'd drawn circles around your and Ethan's names with a black marker. When I asked him why, he just said he was registering you both so the trees would know you were coming. A cold pit settled in my stomach. The idea of Kyler registering us with the forest felt like a dark omen. It wasn't just a quirk, it was a sign that his mind was weaving the wedding into his complex web of shadows and signals. He wasn't just coming to a party, in his head he was participating in a cosmic event that required preparation and offerings. That weekend, Ethan and I went back to the house to help my grandfather with some yard work. We were trying to be helpful to ease the burden on them so they could focus on Kyler, but the tension was unavoidable. While Ethan helped my grandfather clear out the gutters, I stayed inside with my grandmother. The house felt different. It was darker. My grandmother had pulled the curtain shut in almost every room because Kyler had started complaining about the glare from the sun. The only light came from the flickering television in the corner, which was muted. Kyler was sitting on the floor in the hallway surrounded by a pile of old magazines. He was meticulously cutting out photos of eyes, just eyes, and placing them in a small shoebox. Uncle Kyler, I said, softly crouching down a few feet away. What are you working on? He didn't look up, but his scissors continued to snip, snip, snip through the glossy paper. They need to see Maya. The ceremony is blind. If the ceremony is blind, the walkers will stumble. I'm making eyes for the walkers. I looked at my grandmother, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, her hand over her mouth. This was the man who had taught me how to ride a bike. This was the man who used to make the best grilled cheese sandwiches and tell me stories about dragons. Now he was a man cutting eyes out of magazines to help walkers at my wedding. Kyler, I said, my voice trembling. The wedding is going to be very loud. There will be a lot of people. Do you think maybe it would be better if you stayed here, where it's quiet? The scissors stopped. The silence in the hallway became absolute. Kyler slowly turned his head toward me. For the first time in a long time, he looked directly into my eyes. For a split second, I thought I saw a glimmer of the old Kyler, a flash of recognition, of sorrow. You don't want me there, he said. It wasn't a question. It was a flat, hollow statement. I want you to be safe, I said, my heart hammering against my ribs. I want you to be happy, and I don't think a wedding will make you happy. He looked back down at the shoebox of paper eyes. The binding is for the chosen. If I'm not there, who will hold the perimeter? The watchers will get through the gates, Maya. They'll take the groom. They'll take him to the place where time stops. He went back to cutting his movements faster now, more frantic. I stood up feeling a wave of nausea. He wasn't talking about a wedding. He was talking about a battle. He was talking about a world where my future husband was in mortal danger and only his perimeter could save him. I walked into the kitchen where my grandmother was waiting. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around me and let me cry. We stood there for a long time, two women, mourning a man who was still standing in the next room. Later that evening, after Kyler had been coaxed into a shower, a process that involved 20 minutes of negotiation and my grandfather promising him a full pack of cigarettes, my grandparents sat us down. We've talked about it. My grandfather began, his voice gravelly. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, the lines in his face deep and etched with a decade of struggle. We've talked about the logistics. We've talked about the risks. My grandmother nodded, her eyes red-rimmed. Maya, we want you to have the wedding of your dreams. We want it to be perfect. And we realize that having Kyler there, it might not be perfect. Not for you and certainly not for him. I held my breath waiting for the but. But my grandfather continued, we also can't leave him. We've tried to find someone. We called the agency that handles home health care, but they won't send someone for a single day on such short notice, and they won't take on a high-risk patient without a full evaluation process that takes months. We've asked the neighbors, but they're all... Well, they're scared of him. They remember the incident with the truck. So, my grandmother said, her voice breaking, "We've made a choice. Your grandfather is going to stay home with Kyler. I will come to the ceremony. I'll see you walk down the aisle. I'll see you say your vows. And then I'll come straight back home so your grandfather can come to the reception for an hour to see the dances." It was a compromise. A logical, fair, heart-wrenching compromise. My grandfather, the man who had been my rock, who had taught me how to drive, who had walked me through every major moment of my life, wouldn't see me get married. He would be at home, sitting in that smoke-filled living room, watching Kyler cut eyes out of magazines, while his only granddaughter promised her life to another person. "No," I said the word coming out before I could think. "No, Grandpa. That's not fair. You should be there. You're the one who—" "Maya, listen," he interrupted, reaching across the table to pat my hand. "It's okay. It's not what we wanted, but it's the only way to keep everyone safe. If I'm here, I can keep him calm. I can make sure he doesn't go to the woods. I can make sure he doesn't try to find his way to the venue to hold the perimeter." The thought of my grandfather managing Kyler while the rest of the world celebrated was almost more than I could bear. I looked at Ethan, who was silent, his face pale. I knew he was thinking about the highway. I knew he was thinking about the what-ifs. "Is there really no one else?" Ethan asked. "What about a friend or a distant relative?" My grandmother laughed a bitter, sharp sound. "People stopped calling years ago, Ethan. People stopped coming around when they have to worry about a man screaming at them about their secret identities. We are on an island here, just the three of us." That was the reality I had tried to ignore. My grandparents weren't just Kyler's caretakers, they were his fellow prisoners. They had built a life around his illness, a life of locked doors, hidden mirrors, and silent meals. And now my wedding was just another thing that would have to be adapted, scaled down, and compromised to fit within the walls of Kyler's fractured mind. As we drove away that night, I looked back at the house. The lights were dim and I could see the silhouette of Kyler in the window, his hand raised as if he were waving, or perhaps as if he were trying to ward something off. I felt a profound sense of guilt, a weight that sat heavy on my shoulders. I was getting my perfect day, but at what cost? I was excluding my grandfather from my wedding to protect it from my uncle. I was choosing my joy over their presence. And yet, as I thought about the blood binding and the paper eyes, I knew that having him there would be a disaster. I was trapped between two impossible choices, and even though we had found a solution, it felt like a defeat. I wondered if I would ever be able to look at my wedding photos without thinking about my grandfather sitting alone in the dark and Kyler whispering to the watchers in the woods. The decision felt like a lead weight in my stomach. For days after we left my grandparents' house, I walked around in a daze, the logistical solution playing over and over in my head like a broken record. My grandmother would be there for the vows. My grandfather would be there for the dances. It was a fair trade, everyone said. It was the only way everyone insisted. But every time I looked at Ethan, I saw the same shadow of doubt. We were starting our lives together by asking the people who loved us most to split their hearts in two. As the wedding grew closer, now only 3 weeks away, the reality of the Kyler problem didn't fade. It intensified. The atmosphere at my grandparents' house had shifted from a heavy sadness to a vibrating electric tension. Kyler knew something was happening. Even though we had stopped talking about the wedding in front of him, he could feel the shift in the house. He could feel the way my grandmother's hands shook when she made his tea. He could feel the way my grandfather watched him with a hawk-like intensity, never letting him out of his sight for more than a few minutes. I went over there one afternoon to drop off some paperwork for my grandfather. When I walked in, I didn't see Kyler in his usual chair. The house was silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of a clock in the hallway. I found my grandfather in the kitchen, sitting at the small table with his sleeves rolled up. That's when I saw them. Faint purple bruises circled his forearms. They weren't from a fall or a clumsy accident. They were the distinct shape of fingerprints. "Grandpa," I whispered, dropping the folders on the counter. "What happened?" He quickly pulled his sleeves down, but it was too late. He gave me a tired, forced smile. "It's nothing, Maya. Kyler just had a bad night. He thought the watchers were trying to get through the back door, and he was convinced I was one of them. I had to hold him back from running out into the woods at 2 a.m. He's getting stronger, isn't he?" I asked, the fear finally manifesting as a cold, hard knot in my throat. My grandfather looked at his hands, his knuckles swollen. "He's 29, Maya. He's in his physical prime, and when the panic takes him, he has the strength of 3 men. He doesn't mean to hurt me. He doesn't even know it's me. In his head, he's fighting for his life." I sat down across from him, feeling a wave of shame. Here I was, complaining about guest lists and photography packages, while my grandfather was literally wrestling with a man lost in a nightmare, just to keep him from running into traffic. The compromise suddenly felt incredibly fragile. "Grandpa, if he's having episodes like that, how can you stay here alone with him while Grandma is at the ceremony? What if he snaps? What if you can't hold him?" "I'll be fine," he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "I'll keep the doors locked. I'll keep the television on loud. I'll keep him distracted with his cigarettes and his magazines. It's only for a few hours." "A few hours is all it takes for something to go wrong?" I said. "We can't do this. We can't ask you to do this." I left the house that day feeling like the entire wedding was a mistake. I called Ethan crying so hard I could barely get the words out. I told him about the bruises. I told him about the look in my grandfather's eyes, the look of a man who was reaching his breaking point, but refused to let anyone see him fall. Maya, listen to me, Ethan said, his voice calm and steady. We need to rethink this. The relay plan, it's too dangerous, not just for the wedding, but for your grandparents. If Kyler is escalating, leaving one person alone with him, especially when he knows something big is happening, is a recipe for disaster. But what else is there? I sobbed. We've looked into everything. There are no sitters. There are no facilities that will take him for a day. Maybe there's one thing we haven't tried, Ethan said. My cousin works in psychiatric nursing. He knows people who do private high-security home care. It's not a babysitter. It's a professional team. People who are trained to handle violent episodes, people who won't be intimidated by Kyler's delusions. Ethan, that has to be incredibly expensive, I said, wiping my eyes. We've already spent our entire budget on the venue and the catering. Then we cut the catering, Ethan said without hesitation. We have a taco bar instead of a sit-down dinner. We skip the open bar. We do whatever we have to do. Your grandfather's safety and your grandmother's peace of mind are worth more than a fancy meal. I felt a rush of love for him so strong it took my breath away. He was right. We had been looking at this as a wedding problem, but it was a family crisis. The next day, we sat down with my grandparents and presented the idea. We told them we wanted to hire a professional team, 2 trained male nurses, to stay at the house with Kyler for the entire day. This would allow both of my grandparents to attend the ceremony and at least half of the reception together, knowing Kyler was under the care of people who could actually handle him if things turned south. My grandmother's eyes filled with tears. You'd do that. You'd spend your wedding money on that. It's not spending money, Grandma, I said, taking her hand. It's buying peace. We want you both there. We want to look out and see both of your faces when we say our vows. And we want to know that you're safe. For a moment, it felt like the weight had lifted. My grandfather looked relieved, his shoulders finally dropping from their defensive hunch. We started making calls, and Ethan's cousin came through with a recommendation for a private firm that specialized in difficult home placements. They were expensive more than our venue deposit, but they were available. But as with everything involving Kyler, the relief was short-lived. 2 nights later, Kyler had the worst episode of his life. My grandmother called me at 3 a.m., her voice hysterical. Kyler hadn't just tried to run, he had smashed every single window in the back of the house. He said the watchers were no longer in the woods, they were looking through the glass. He had used the chair to shatter the panes, and then he had tried to climb out through the jagged shards. He was currently in the hospital under a mandatory 72-hour hold. I rushed to the hospital with my parents and Ethan. We found my grandparents, sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room of the psych ward. They looked like they had been through a war. My grandfather had a bandage on his hand where he'd been cut by some of the glass while trying to pull Kyler back. He's sedated now, my grandmother said, her voice a hollow shell. They have him on a heavy dose, but the doctor said this is different, Maya. He's not just having delusions anymore. He's becoming actively self-destructive. He's a danger to himself in a way he hasn't been before. What does this mean for the wedding? I asked, and then immediately felt like the most selfish person on earth. My uncle was in a locked ward, and I was worried about my party. It means he might not be home, my grandfather said. If they decide he needs long-term stabilization, he'll be moved to a state facility. He could be there for weeks or months. There was a long, heavy silence. My grandmother looked at the floor. I should be happy, shouldn't I? If he's in the hospital, then we can all go to the wedding. The problem is solved, right? She looked up at me and the pain in her eyes was unbearable. But he's my son Maya. He's in a cage and he's terrified and his brain is telling him that the world is ending. How can I stand at a wedding and eat cake while he's being pumped full of drugs in a room with no windows? I realized then that there was no solving this. Even if Kyler wasn't physically at the wedding, his illness was. It was a guest that couldn't be uninvited. It sat at the table, it walked down the aisle, and it lived in the hearts of everyone who loved him. The 3 weeks leading up to the wedding became a countdown of a different sort. Would Kyler be released? Would he be committed? And if he was released, would the professional team be enough to keep the peace? Or would the watchers follow him back to the house? 10 days before the wedding, the hospital called. Kyler was being released, the hold was over, and they didn't have the beds for long-term care. He was coming home, and he was more convinced than ever that the blood binding was the reason for his suffering. In his mind, the hospital stay wasn't a medical necessity. It was an abduction by the watchers to keep him from protecting me. He was coming home and the wedding was only 10 days away. The day Kyler came home from the hospital felt like the air had been sucked out of the room before he even crossed the threshold. My grandfather had spent the morning boarding up the windows he'd smashed, replacing the jagged holes with thick sheets of plywood. It made the house look like it was bracing for a hurricane, or perhaps like a tomb. When the silver sedan pulled into the driveway, Ethan and I were there standing on the porch with my grandmother. I'll never forget the way Kyler looked as he stepped out of the car. He had lost even more weight, his clothes hanging off his frame like rags on a scarecrow. His skin had a sickly grayish pallor from the lack of sunlight, and his eyes, usually darting and frantic, were glazed over heavy with the cocktail of antipsychotics the hospital had pumped into him. He didn't look at us. He didn't even acknowledge that he was home. He walked straight past my grandmother, who had her arms open for a hug, and headed for his room. The only sound was the heavy thud of his boots on the plywood floor. He's not himself, my grandfather whispered, his voice cracking. They've got him so doped up he can barely hold a fork, but they said it was the only way to keep him from clawing at his own skin. The professional team arrived an hour later. Their names were Marcus and David, and they were exactly what Ethan's cousin had promised: large, calm men with the kind of steady, unblinking eyes that told you they had seen everything and weren't easily rattled. They wore plain black polos and khakis, looking more like private security than medical professionals. When they walked into the house, the atmosphere shifted. For the first time in years, my grandparents weren't the only ones standing between Kyler and the edge of a cliff. "We'll take the guest room," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. "We'll rotate shifts. One of us will be in the common area at all times. If he moves, we move. If he tries the door, we're there." My grandmother looked like she wanted to cry with relief, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes: shame. To her, bringing in professionals felt like an admission that her love wasn't enough to keep her son safe. I watched her lead them through the house, showing them the locks, the medicine cabinet, and the designated smoking area on the back porch. I saw her hand trembling as she pointed out the woods, explaining Kyler's obsession with the offerings. "He thinks the wedding is a ritual," I told David while Marcus was in the other room. "He calls it a blood binding. He thinks he has to protect me from watchers. Is he going to be okay with you being here?" David gave me a small, reassuring smile. "We've worked with patients who have similar fixations, Maya. To him, we might just be more watchers, or we might be guards. We'll stay out of his way as much as possible, but we won't let him leave the property. You focus on your wedding, let us handle the perimeter." Focus on the wedding. It sounded so simple, but as the days ticked down, it felt impossible. Ethan and I spent our evenings at our kitchen table, not looking at seating charts, but at our bank account. To pay for Marcus and David, we had to make some brutal cuts. The 4-course plated dinner was gone, replaced by a local taco truck that agreed to set up a buffet. The open bar was slashed to just beer and wine. The professional videographer was canceled. "Do you regret it?" I asked Ethan one night, staring at a spreadsheet that looked more like a casualty list. "The wedding isn't going to be what we planned. It's going to be smaller, less grand." Ethan reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was warm and solid, a stark contrast to the cold uncertainty that had defined my life lately. "Maya, look at me. I don't care if we're eating tacos on paper plates in a parking lot. I care that your grandmother can sit in the front row and watch you walk toward me without looking over her shoulder every 5 seconds. I care that your grandfather doesn't have to wrestle a grown man to the ground while we're saying our vows. This is the best money we've ever spent." I leaned my head on his shoulder, feeling a rare moment of peace. We were making a sacrifice, yes, but it was a sacrifice for the people who had sacrificed everything for us. But as the wedding day loomed only 3 days away, Kyler began to wake up from his medicinal fog. The heavy sedation started to wear off, or perhaps his mind was simply powerful enough to claw its way back through the chemicals. He started talking again. Not to us, but to the plywood on the windows. "The binding is coming," he would mutter, his voice loud enough to carry through the thin walls. "The moon is wrong. The watchers are wearing suits. They're hiding their eyes behind the fabric." He became obsessed with Marcus and David. He would stand in the hallway inches from them, staring at their faces with an intensity that would have terrified me. He didn't yell. He didn't even speak. He just watched them, his lips moving in a silent rhythm, his fingers constantly twitching as if he were counting something invisible. "He thinks you're part of it," my grandmother told Marcus. "He told me this morning that the men in black were here to harvest the light from the ceremony." Marcus just nodded unfazed. "We've heard worse, ma'am. As long as he stays inside the house, he can think we're from Mars for all I care." The night before the wedding, I couldn't sleep. I stayed at my parents' house according to tradition, but my mind was 10 miles away at my grandparents' ranch. I kept imagining the plywood windows, the smoke-filled air, and Kyler standing in the hallway waiting for a blood binding, that his broken mind had turned into a war. I thought about the offerings he hadn't been allowed to leave in the woods for a week. I wondered if the watchers were in his mind growing angry. I called my grandmother at midnight. I expected her to be asleep, but she picked up on the first ring. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my heart racing. "He's quiet, Maya," she said, her voice sounding incredibly old. "Marcus is in the living room with him. Kyler is just sitting there. He's been cutting things out of the magazines again. He hasn't slept in 24 hours. "What is he cutting out?" There was a long pause. I could hear the sound of a lighter clicking in the background. My grandmother had taken up the habit again, the stress finally breaking her resolve. "Suit jackets," she said finally. "He's cutting the lapels off pictures of men in suits. He says the watchers hide their stingers there. He says he's disarming the guest." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Tomorrow, dozens of men in suits would be gathered at a beautiful estate, unaware that a few miles away, a man was cutting paper lapels to protect them from imaginary stingers. It felt like 2 different worlds were about to collide, and even with Marcus and David there, I felt like the glass was starting to crack. "Go to sleep, sweetheart," my grandmother said, her voice softening. "Tomorrow is your day. We'll be there, all of us except Kyler. But he'll be safe, I promise." I hung up the phone and stared at my wedding dress hanging on the back of the door. It was white and pure and perfect. It represented a new beginning, a clean slate. But as I looked at it, I couldn't help but think of the paper eyes and the blood binding. I wondered if you could ever truly leave the shadows behind, or if some stories were just destined to be told in the dark. The morning of my wedding was a blur of unnatural perfection. The sun rose over the estate, casting a golden light across the manicured lawns and the stone fountain that sparkled like a handful of diamonds. In the bridal suite, the air was cool and smelled of expensive perfume and hairspray. My bridesmaids were a whirlwind of silk robes and laughter, clinking champagne flutes and talking about the day ahead. To anyone looking through the window, it was the picture-perfect start to a fairy tale wedding. But inside my head, there was a persistent low-frequency hum of anxiety that wouldn't let go. Every time someone mentioned how beautiful the day was, I thought about the boarded-up windows 10 miles away. Every time a bridesmaid laughed, I heard the snip, snip, snip of Kyler's scissors cutting eyes and suit lapels. As I sat in the makeup chair, I found myself staring into the large, ornate mirror. For a second, I felt a jolt of pure panic, remembering Kyler's warning. They'll trap our souls in the glass. I had to force myself to take a deep breath to feel the cool air in my lungs and remind myself that Kyler's reality wasn't mine. But that's the thing about growing up with someone like Kyler. Their shadows have a way of stretching out and touching everything you love. You start to doubt the stability of the floor beneath your feet because you've seen how easily it can crumble for someone else. When the time finally came to put on my dress, a heavy silence fell over the room. It was a beautiful gown, ivory lace with a long sweeping train. As my mother buttoned the back, her fingers were steady, but I could see the redness in her eyes. We didn't talk about Kyler. We didn't talk about the hospital or Marcus and David. For those few minutes, we pretended that we were just a normal family getting ready for a normal day. "You look breathtaking, Maya," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really do." I looked at myself, and for the first time that morning, I didn't see the Kyler problem. I saw a bride. I saw a 20-year-old woman who was about to start a life with a man who loved her enough to spend his wedding budget on her grandparents' safety. That thought gave me a surge of strength I didn't know I had. Just as we were about to head down for the ceremony, there was a soft knock on the door. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was it a call from Marcus? Had something happened? But when the door opened, it was my grandfather. I've seen my grandfather in a lot of different states, covered in dirt from the garden, exhausted in the psych ward waiting room, or bruised from wrestling Kyler, but I had almost never seen him in a suit. He looked magnificent. The charcoal gray fabric fit him well, and though he looked tired, there was a light in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Standing next to him was my grandmother, wearing a soft lavender dress and a corsage of white roses. "We're here, Maya," my grandmother said, her voice filled with a desperate, beautiful joy. "We're both here." I couldn't help it. I burst into tears, the lace of my dress rustling as I ran to them. We stood in the middle of the bridal suite, a tangle of ivory, lavender, and charcoal, holding onto each other like survivors of a shipwreck who had finally reached the shore. "How is he?" I asked, pulling back just enough to look at my grandfather. "He's fine," he promised, though I could see the shadow of a lie behind his smile. "Marcus and David have everything under control." Kyler was sitting on the back porch when we left, smoking a cigarette and watching the trees. He didn't even notice us leave. He was peaceful in his own way. "The doors are locked," my grandmother added, as if reminding herself, "and the men have their phones. They know to call your father if anything at all changes. But for now," my grandfather said, standing tall and offering me his arm, "we are here for you. We are not caretakers today, Maya. We are just your grandparents." As we walked toward the garden where the ceremony was to be held, I felt a strange sense of surrealism. The music began to play a soft acoustic version of a song Ethan and I had chosen months ago. I could see the guests seated in rows, the sun catching the colors of their dresses and suits, and there at the end of the long white aisle stood Ethan. He looked so handsome it made my throat ache. He was watching me with an expression of such pure, unadulterated love that for a moment the rest of the world vanished. As I walked down the aisle, flanked by my mother and my grandfather, I looked at the front row. There were 2 empty seats next to my grandmother, a silent acknowledgement of the man who couldn't be there. But seeing my grandmother and grandfather sitting together holding hands was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. They were witnessing a beginning, a moment of light in a decade of darkness. The ceremony was a blur of vows and rings and the scent of jasmine. I remember the weight of Ethan's hands as he held mine. I remember the way the officiant talked about building a house on a firm foundation. I couldn't help but think that our foundation wasn't made of stone or wood, but of the hard-won resilience of a family that refused to let a tragedy define them. When we were finally pronounced husband and wife, a cheer went up from the crowd. Ethan kissed me, and for a second I forgot about the blood binding and the watchers. I forgot about the boarded-up windows and the paper eyes. I was just Maya, and he was Ethan, and we were whole. But as we walked back up the aisle as a married couple, I saw my grandfather discreetly reach into his jacket pocket and pull out his phone. He checked the screen, his face unreadable for a split second, before he tucked it back away and joined the standing ovation. The peace was holding, but it was a peace that required constant monitoring. At the reception, the atmosphere was lighter. The taco truck was a huge hit. Everyone loved the casual fun vibe, and people were already lining up for seconds. The beer and wine were flowing, and the music was upbeat. I saw my grandparents on the dance floor moving slowly to an old ballad. It was a sight I never thought I'd see again. The two of them lost in a moment that had nothing to do with medication schedules or safety locks. But I also noticed that Ethan and my father were huddled in a corner with their phones out. I walked over to them, my heart beginning to race again. "What is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice low so the other guests wouldn't hear. "Did Marcus call?" My father looked at me, his expression cautious. "He didn't call Maya. He sent a text. Kyler's had a bit of a setback. What kind of setback? He's not violent, my father said quickly, but he started doing something new. Marcus said he's gathered every single cigarette in the house, dozens of packs, and he's laid them out in a massive circle in the middle of the living room. He's sitting in the center of the circle, and he won't move. He says he's fueling the protection. He's been there for 2 hours. Ethan added, his hand resting on my waist. Marcus said he's calm, but he's refusing to eat or drink. He's just waiting. I looked over at my grandparents, who were still dancing, oblivious to the news. They looked so happy. They looked like they had finally found a small island of normalcy in a sea of chaos. Don't tell them. I said the word, surprising even me. Don't tell them yet. Let them have this. Let them have 1 more hour of being just a grandma and a grandpa. Maya, if he escalates, my father started. If he escalates, Marcus will call, I interrupted. But right now, he's just sitting in a circle of cigarettes. He's safe. The house is locked. Let my grandparents have their dance. As I watched them, I realized that this was what the day was really about. It wasn't about the perfect flowers or the fancy food. It was about creating a memory that was strong enough to survive the dark days that were surely ahead. It was about choosing to celebrate the light even when you know the shadows are just outside the door. The rest of the reception was a blur of bittersweet joy. I moved through the crowd like a ghost in a beautiful dress, hugging relatives I hadn't seen in years, laughing at jokes I only half heard, and posing for photos with a smile that felt more like a mask with every passing hour. Every time I caught my grandfather's eye, my heart did a painful little somersault. He looked so light on his feet, so remarkably present. He was chatting with an old friend from the railroad, a beer in his hand, his head thrown back, and a genuine laugh. Beside him, my grandmother was radiant, her lavender dress catching the late afternoon sun, as she moved from table to table, showing off her corsage like a prize. They were free. For a few hours, the Kyler problem was someone else's responsibility. They weren't checking the locks. They weren't negotiating with a man about a shower. They weren't watching the edge of the woods for watchers. They were just a grandmother and a grandfather at their granddaughter's wedding. And I was the keeper of the secret, the knowledge that back at the ranch, their son was sitting in a circle of cigarettes, caught in a silent vigil against a world only he could see. Ethan stayed close to me, his hand a constant grounding presence on the small of my back. He knew. He saw the way my eyes flickered toward my father every time he checked his phone. He saw the way I tensed up whenever the music dipped between songs, as if I expected to hear the sound of shattering glass or a distant familiar scream. "You're doing great, Maya," he whispered into my ear as we stood by the taco truck waiting for a fresh batch of carnitas. "They're having the time of their lives. Look at them." "I feel like a liar," I admitted, my voice barely audible over the sound of a nearby salsa track. "They think everything is fine. They think Marcus and David have turned the house into a sanctuary, but Kyler is... He's doing it again, Ethan. He's building something. He's preparing for a war that isn't happening. But he's safe," Ethan reminded me, his voice firm. "Marcus said he's calm. He's not hurting himself. He's just being Kyler. And for today, that's enough. We've bought them this time, Maya. Let them spend it." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, it was time for the toasts. My father went first, giving a speech that was short, emotional, and carefully avoided any mention of the difficulties the family had faced. Then my grandfather stood up. The room went quiet. He didn't have a piece of paper. He didn't need one. He stood there tall and proud in his charcoal suit, looking at me with a gaze so full of love it made my breath hitch. "I've seen a lot of things in my 70 years, he began, his voice gravelly but steady. "I've seen hard times and I've seen good times. But looking at Maya today, I see hope. I see the kind of love that doesn't just happen by accident. I see the kind of love that is a choice to stay, a choice to protect, and a choice to build something beautiful, even when the world feels like it's trying to tear it down." He paused, his eyes drifting for a fraction of a second to the empty chair beside my grandmother. A shadow of pain crossed his face, so brief most people probably missed it, but I saw it. I saw the weight of the man who wasn't there. "Maya and Ethan," he continued, raising his glass, "you've shown us all what it means to be a family. You've shown us that love isn't just about the easy days. It's about the days when the windows are boarded up and the sky is dark. It's about holding the line for each other. To the bride and groom, may your love always be a light in the dark, and may you always find your way home." The toast was met with a roar of applause, and more than a few tears. I looked at my grandmother, who was openly weeping, her hand clutched to her chest. I realized then that they knew. They didn't know about the circle of cigarettes, but they knew the cost of their presence here. They knew what Marcus and David represented. They knew that their joy today was a fragile, expensive gift, and they were savoring every drop of it. After the toasts, the dancing began in earnest. I danced with my father, then with Ethan, and then finally with my grandfather. As we moved slowly across the stone patio, the music soft and low, he leaned in and whispered, "Thank you, Maya." "For what, Grandpa?" "For giving us today," he said, his voice thick. "I know what you did. I know about the catering. I know about the videographer. I know you gave up your perfect wedding to make sure we could be here together." "It is perfect, Grandpa," I said, burying my face in his shoulder so he wouldn't see me cry. "It's exactly what I wanted." "He's been quiet, hasn't he?" he asked, his tone shifting to something more serious. Marcus hasn't called? He's fine, Grandpa. He's just resting. He nodded, but he didn't press for more details. He knew I was protecting him just as he had spent his life protecting me. In that moment, the roles had reversed and we both accepted the new dynamic with a silent, heavy understanding. As the reception wound down and guests began to filter out toward the parking lot, the real world began to seep back in. My father pulled me aside one last time. Marcus called 10 minutes ago, he said, his face grim. The circle of cigarettes, Kyler started lighting them, not to smoke them. He's just lighting them and sticking them upright in the carpet. Marcus and David had to intervene to keep the house from catching fire. They've moved him to his room and locked the door. He's screaming, Maya. He thinks the watchers are coming through the floorboards now. The news hit me like a physical blow. The peace was over. The island of normalcy had been submerged by the rising tide of Kyler's illness. We have to go, my grandmother said, appearing behind my father. She had seen the look on his face. The grandma mask was gone, replaced by the weary, vigilant face of the caretaker. The party's over, isn't it? We'll take you home, Mom, my father said softly. I watched as my grandparents changed before my eyes. They straightened their clothes, gathered their things, and prepared to go back to the front lines. The charcoal suit and the lavender dress suddenly looked like costumes relics of a dream they were waking up from. Go on your honeymoon, Maya, my grandfather said, hugging me one last time. Don't look back. Don't check your phone. You've done enough, more than enough. But as they walked toward the car, I knew I would be looking back. I knew I would be checking my phone. Because Kyler wasn't just a guest who couldn't come. He was a part of us. He was the broken piece of our family heart, and you can't just leave a piece of your heart behind, no matter how much it hurts to carry it. Ethan and I drove to our hotel in silence. The just married sign on the back of the car clattered against the bumper, a festive sound that felt entirely out of place. When we got to the room, I didn't feel like a bride. I felt like a soldier who had just finished a long, grueling mission and was waiting for the next one to begin. I sat on the edge of the bed, still in my ivory lace dress, and looked at the wedding ring on my finger. It was beautiful. It was a circle, a symbol of eternity. But as I looked at it, I couldn't help but think of the other circle, the one made of cigarettes burning in the dark of a boarded-up house. I realized then that life isn't about the absence of shadows. It's about finding someone who will stand with you in the middle of them. It's about the people who will help you board up the windows and the people who will spend their last dollar to make sure you're not standing alone when the watchers come. Ethan sat down beside me and pulled me into his arms. We did it, Maya, he said. We're a family now. Your family, my family. And all the shadows that come with them, we'll handle it together. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. The story of Kyler isn't over. It will never truly be over. There will be more snaps, more hospitals, and more offerings left at the edge of the woods. But there will also be more weddings, more births, and more moments of light. We can't fix the broken minds of the people we love, and we can't always protect them from the monsters they see in the mirrors. But we can choose how we stand by them. We can choose to hire the guards to stay the night and to dance even when the floor is shaking. If you've ever had to navigate the complex world of mental illness within your family, you know that there are no easy answers. You know that love is often messy, expensive, and exhausting. But I want to ask you, how far would you go to protect the peace of the people you love? Would you change your perfect day to save a piece of someone else's soul? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a similar situation where you had to choose between your own happiness and the safety of a family member? Your stories help remind us that we aren't alone in these shadows. And if you want to hear more stories about the hidden complexities of family and the strength it takes to keep going, please subscribe and join our community.